Hi, everybody. I wanted to do just a brief second Thucydides lecture. I'll do a longer one once we get to the end of the book. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the things from the discussion questions that you prepared responses for. Overall, I thought people did a great job with those responses, which is one reason I don't feel like I need to do a long lecture on the topic. And I did make available to everybody the responses from students. And as I always do, I pull out certain responses from certain students, and then I kind of make some annotations here and there, maybe add a little bit of extra stuff that I think is important, maybe some things that weren't mentioned that I think are important. But I really think those are really strong responses. And so you have those when it comes to understanding Pericles' war speech, the funeral oration, the plague, and then his final speech. But again, I just wanted to do just a few extra things about those here with you now. The building program that is talked about in the book and also in the discussion questions was obviously a really important part of Pericles' legacy. I'm going to pop something up on the screen here real quickly for you. Pericles building campaign. And remember that this was a way of trying to really rebuild Athens, rebuild its reputation, its sense of pride in itself, the fact that it had survived being ransacked twice by the Persians. The second time, you remember that I mentioned that they actually left Athens itself and went out on their ships and just basically had to allow the Persian people to destroy the city, and that they could see that from out on their ships, and that must have been very difficult for them given how much pride they had in themselves as a people, etc. So the rebuilding campaign was sort of a part of returning it to its previous glory. It was extremely expensive. There were what we would today consider millions and millions of dollars that were put into a lot of the things that were built during the time. As you know, part of many of these buildings still exist today, the Parthenon being one of them. Also, as I'll show you in a minute, the Temple of Athena, Athena being the kind of the patron saint goddess of the, as it was viewed in mythological terms, of the Athenian people. As it also says here in this brief slide, thanking the gods and the patron Athena in particular for allowing them to be successful in defeating the Persians twice. As I mentioned, glorifying the city with this aesthetic tradition that would continue. And in fact, after Athens is destroyed by Sparta, that aesthetic or artistic tradition even gets stronger. Athens doesn't have its empire anymore. It doesn't have the wealth it once had. It doesn't have the ability to amass wealth and all of the fine things that came from around, the Aegean Sea, from all the other city-states and all the other peoples that it could trade for in terms of, clothing and furniture and other kinds of food and other kinds of goods that you would want to have when you lived in a luxurious kind of state. And obviously Athens prided itself on that, was no longer really available to them. So they focused more on the arts. They focused more on philosophy. And really what we think of as the great height of Athens ultimately in terms of the arts and in terms of philosophy, that only becomes something that's shared among the larger society in Athens after the defeat by Sparta. Now, certainly Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, as we know, were around during the time of the wars. But those philosophical traditions were basically just circulating within the wealthy males of Athens. But really, Athens being known for embracing rationality and for philosophy, and that really being popularized only really happened after the war. And the same thing with the arts. Obviously, we had this great architecture and things that were created during this building campaign. But in terms of the work of artisans and the things that we identify with artisans, especially Athens became very famous for its pottery. And rather than just having pottery have a practical purpose and just some general kind of design to it, there were potters that really developed incredible painting techniques and took great pride in it. They would actually sign their names to the pottery that they created. A lot of it was to hold things like olive oil, and they would actually sometimes write little messages proclaiming themselves and their greatness as artists, and kind of talking trash to some of the other artisans and claiming that these other artisans could paint as well as they could, etc. So that really becomes more of a focal point after the defeat by Sparta. The last thing that's mentioned here too is important: manpower, right? To provide employment for many of the tradesmen and workers. This Pericles building campaign was really important for that, to get people back to work, practice their trades again, and again, do it in a new way that would, bring even greater respect and pride to the Athenian people. And this was obviously one of Pericles' main legacies, was this building campaign. Certainly a legacy that in the long term has greater standing than does his getting them involved in this war with Sparta, which again, we know that they were defeated in. So I wanted to share that with you briefly and just to show you an example from that. And this is an artist rendering of the temple, the Athena temple. And you can see that this huge statue of Athena at the back of the temple. And from what I've seen in other renderings, this seems to be pretty accurate in terms of how large this statue was of Athena inside this temple. Parts of which still exist. The statue itself does not still exist. It also was encrusted with all kinds of jewels, and these jewels, some of them were really large. They had to be fitting for such a large statue. Those were obviously ransacked, stolen, etc. And then the statue itself eventually was taken away or collapsed, etc. But this was, as you can imagine, extremely expensive to build, but would have brought great pride to the city. You can kind of see some triremes on either side of Athena here. You can see that she's actually holding a spear. There's a serpent around the spear, so you can see some of the detail here. But this was of great pride to the Athenian people, this particular part of the Athenian building campaign. I would say the Parthenon and this temple were probably the two most famous structures that were built during this campaign. So I just wanted to share those with you briefly. Pericles' war speech was something that I had you answer some questions about. It was something that was made obviously to appeal to the Athenian people. There are two elements of it in particular that I wanted to mention. Number one, like some of the great generals of the time, one of the ways in which you would appeal to the people, especially the young males who would fight the war, is to tell them that the war would have been their opportunity to become heroes, right? To exercise the kind of courage that Aristotle talked about, right? And that this was how they would make their fame and fortune, right? Was becoming a war hero. And every young Athenian boy who grew up knew, he learned of the history, the stories, the legends of the great deeds of the heroes, who obviously became larger than life through these stories that were told. This was one way to motivate the young Athenians to want to partake in the war and to see it as, this is your opportunity for your generation to do great things for Athens the way previous generations had done. And certainly it had an appeal to the people overall and to the society and how great it was. But in particular, there was a focus on the individual as making their fame and fortune. One of the aspects of the war speech that is important, and I think that Thucydides included this, is a bit of foreshadowing. My sense is probably it was a part of whatever speech Pericles actually gave, but Thucydides may have brought it out more as foreshadowing. And this was Pericles emphasizing that Athens really needed to focus on maintaining what it already had of its empire, not to try to use this war as a means of expanding its empire even further. It was enough of a challenge to maintain that empire, to be able to control it as large as it was, again, stretching all the way around the Aegean. And that's what they should really focus on, maintaining that empire, right? I mean, they had made an enemy of Sparta, the Peloponnesian League, the larger Lacedaemonian people, because of its empire becoming so large that it was seen to be a threat to these other peoples. And there was no real benefit to trying to expand that empire through the war. But the focus should really be on trying to maintain the empire it already had. And Pericles kind of emphasizing that if we do that, we will win this war. We are more powerful, right? We have this great navy that was obviously really emphasized here. That was something that Sparta did not have. So focus on that, focus on maintaining our empire, and we'll necessarily win this war. And so I really wanted to kind of heighten, that, emphasize that part of his speech. The funeral oration, I thought the responses to that were really great. That one definitely also appealed to, again, previous generations, and what the sacrifices that they had made. This emphasized even more patriotism in terms of appealing to Athens, and appealing even more, I would say, to the previous generations than the original war speech did, where that seemed to focus more on the individual, and again, the individual's opportunity to become a hero. The funeral oration was, not just aimed towards the young warriors; it was aimed toward the society overall to keep fighting. It had some victories, but it also was starting to have some defeats at this point, and the idea that yes, we've had our casualties, but we've done well so far. We need to keep moving forward as a people overall, right? Everybody has to do their job while they're fighting the war. While the males are away fighting the war, the women have to take over some of the jobs that the males had undertaken previously. So it was basically about this larger kind of patriotism for Athens overall, and everybody playing their part. And again, thinking about the previous generations, et cetera. So it was pitched a little bit differently than the individual war speech was. It was pitched more to the Athenian people overall, whereas the war speech was I think focused more on the individual warrior. And then we know we had this plague, where, again, I've seen it mentioned maybe a quarter of the Athenian population died during the plague. I've seen maybe up to a third of the population, but obviously huge numbers of people. And this was tough on Pericles because it was really his strategy, as from way I understand it, and the way Thucydides talked about it, to pull everybody within the walls of the city, to only focus on naval campaigns, and to allow the Spartans to kind of burn themselves out and just become frustrated because Athens would not fight them in open battle on the land, right? And even allowing Sparta to destroy some of the farmland and the kind of the little villages that were outside of the city. Again, to kind of just either get tired of fighting the war or be forced to go out and engage Athens on the water where it would necessarily lose. So this was important, not just to the Athenian people, but it was also important really to Pericles and to his legacy. And here's a picture I know I showed you a larger map of the area. Here's a picture that shows a little closer up with a scale of miles. This wall, the north wall you can see, and the south long wall, Piraeus being the name of this port, and you can see it's pretty good sized. You can see how large Athens was in relationship to Piraeus. There was another smaller port at Phalerum that was not protected by the long walls that you can see here, that Piraeus, leading between Piraeus and Athens. You can see that this mall was several miles long. It was very large. It had to be very stout, very well supported, so that Athens could move goods and its sailors from Athens and Piraeus, back and forth, and was a really important part of them being able to fight this war. You might remember too that when the Corinthian people went to Sparta to try to get them to pay attention to what Athens was doing, and it was becoming more and more powerful to the point that it could maybe be defeated if it got much more powerful. They talked about these walls. If you've allowed them to build these walls between Athens and Piraeus, the Corinthian people knew how important that was. That it made their navy even that much more powerful, and it made it that much more powerful of a city-state because it was getting to the point where maybe you couldn't defeat it on land anymore, and again, it could just focus on its navy. That could have been, again, a little foreshadowing on Thucydides' part to have the Corinthians emphasize the long walls, but nonetheless, it became really important here. So really significant for the Athenian people being able to fight this war. We know, unfortunately, however, it did not protect him from the plague. And when you have lots of people living in a very small area, Athens, behind the walls of Athens, was not made to hold as many people as it was when all the villagers and the people living in the farms, etc., had to go inside the city walls. So really cramped quarters, and much more difficult for clean water and food. And in fact, typically they believe the plague was brought from rats in the grain boats that would come into the city. Grain was obviously the most important kind of sustenance they would have, because you could make bread with it and other kinds of things that were important part of the diet of the Athenian people. And so it was maybe almost inevitable, I think we would say today, that over the years that a plague would eventually have developed. And I wanted to share you briefly a picture of, again, an artist rendering of what this plague might have looked like. And you can see people dying in the streets, kind of up in arms, the cramped quarters, bodies lying in the streets, people looking thin, like they had not had as much to eat as they maybe should have, and just feeling like they were probably at many points ready to give up, right? And obviously they needed Pericles to help them to keep fighting the war, which is why Pericles' last speech then was so important. Thucydides, we know, also got the plague, knew how horrible it was, and it may be one of the reasons that he described it in such detail, actually using some of Aristotle's words to describe the plague. And I think he really wanted to show here, and I think the editor of our particular volume of Thucydides history wanted to show this as well. Athens was a proud people. They believed in their superiority. They believed that they had sprung like seeds from Attica, from that part of the landmass surrounding Athens. They were of that land. And they were a different people, right? The people tended to emphasize more their individual heritage than emphasize their relationships between the different peoples that we would now sort of emphasize looking back at their ancestors and recognizing, that all of these different city-states were ultimately connected if you look back however many generations, right? They emphasized more their individuality, um, their difference in their cultures, the different dialects that they would speak. You may remember from social studies, there were 3 different kinds of columns that represented the different cultural orders: Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian, right? And the one had a very simple kind of column design with no ornamentation. One had the scrolls at the top of the columns, and then the most elaborate one was the Corinthian columns. They actually had um, what looked like leaves and kind of and flora on the top of the columns. Those represented the different cultural orders. This was again part of the Corinthians wanting to fight the war against Athens, because they realized they were worried that they would lose their cultural heritage, their dialect, their gods, which they identified with as, that was a part of their individuality, um, and that they would lose this by being kind of swallowed up by Athens. So it really emphasized, everybody really did, their individuality as individual city-states and individual distinctive cultures. And the Athenians are particularly proud of themselves as an individual culture. And again, saw themselves as not being related over time with Sparta and with these other Athenian peoples, but as being unique and individual. And so they were very proud of that, obviously. And I think Thucydides wanted to show them that they were fallible, just like other people were. Maybe even foreshadowing their eventual defeat in the plague, and in the fact that everybody can ultimately be defeated. They had a lot of hubris in their belief in their superiority, and that they could do anything. They just put their minds to it. And I think maybe Thucydides was foreshadowing the fact that they can't, that there are forces that are larger than they are, like this plague, for example. The other thing I think he wanted to really emphasize was that, and this is something I think the author of our version of the history wanted to emphasize, and you can see it in the title of the volume. And it's human nature that human beings will become inhumane, do basically anything, and act irrationally to try and survive in very difficult circumstances. It has nothing to do with the Athenian people overall. That they ended up, the raping and pillaging, people actually killing people within their own families for scraps of food and clean water, and just complete chaos developing. You'd have these power vacuums developed where the powerful people, when they would die, other people would want to come in and take their positions from them. And again, that would cause great chaos. And he wasn't saying anything about, the Athenian people here, that they kind of fell into, behaving this way. But I think Thucydides was saying it's in human nature. Anybody who's put under duress in this way, anybody who's put in these kind of horrible circumstances, any human beings will kind of fall apart and act this way, and that it's a part of human nature to do this. So it's not a commentary on the Athenian people themselves, except for the fact that maybe it's trying to, again, to let them know that you're no better than other peoples, even though you think you are, and that you're just as susceptible to human nature as anybody else is, and to the destruction that was caused, and to the inhuman behavior of the people during the plague. And so again, I think Thucydides is wanting to show that that's really a part of human nature here. And again, maybe foreshadowing their eventual defeat at the hands of the Spartans. And then again, we have Pericles' final speech. There's a painting here to share with you real briefly of Thucydides. Of Pericles giving a speech. This is, I think people believe it's probably from the first speech that Pericles gave. And you can see the Parthenon in the background. Parthenon is the largest building right here. There's what was called the Parthenon frieze, which is it kind of tells a story along the outside of the building. A frieze is it's just partly three-dimensional, but not completely three-dimensional. So it's kind of a carving in these stones depicting the Athenian people, and it's a relief sculpture. So, it is at least somewhat three-dimensional, but not completely. And it portrayed great deeds, great events in the history of Athens. In particular, they're defeating the Persians. Some of it still actually does exist, of this Parthenon frieze. And in terms of Athenian architecture, it's probably viewed today as the most important part of it, and maybe the thing the Athenians were most proud of. But this is the Parthenon. Over on this other side is the Temple of Athena. This is one of the large meeting halls here. Remember that this is up on the Acropolis. You can kind of see here that this is a raised area. The Acropolis was just this raised area that had a plateau at the top that they believed was something that could never be taken from them, that it was perfectly defensible. The walls were very steep, and that if they had to, and they were attacked, and if the city walls of Athens were breached, they still had the Acropolis, is this outcropping of rocks that was very steep that they could, where they could protect themselves, that could not be, overtaken. It also had walls of its own that you can kind of see here. In fact, they realized and found that it was not perfectly, defensible. And actually, there was at one point before all of this, Pericles buildings were here, but where previous architecture was here, when there was a popular uprising in Athens, and the Athenian people themselves actually were able to scale the rocks and the walls that existed when there was a tyrant who was the leader of Athens at the time, and they overthrew this tyrant. So they weren't completely defensible, but nonetheless, it was a perfect place to build a city, because you did have the Acropolis there, and you can see it in some of the pictures of Athens. But you can see Pericles holding forth here with the speech, telling the people that, yes, we can engage in this war. We need to be thoughtful about how we do it. If we do it the right way, we can't lose the war. And it's also to bring some pride here in this picture in particular, to show again the greatness of the Athenian people. You can see part of a column here, a sculptor here with a sculpting tool. Somebody here, it looks like they have some armor and some painting that they're doing, and there's food here. This to me looks like probably a shepherd. So this is representative of the great things that Athens is capable of, and the painting is supposed to really display that. Pericles is in the kind of helmet that they would wear during wartime. I'm sure you've seen things that look similar to this. You can see that there's the young Athenian males that he's really trying to make his appeal to. These aren't gray-haired people for the most part. They look younger. That he's trying to tell them, here's your opportunity for fame. If we fight this war, you can become a hero like your parents, or like your parents' parents, etc., like previous generations. And so you can see that there in this particular picture. So it does represent, I think, a lot of important things here. It tells a story, right? It's more than just what you see initially when you look at this. There's a lot of meaning in it. So we knew Pericles gave this final speech after things had gotten much tougher for the Athenians in the war. At that point, it was obviously before Pericles died in the plague, and he did eventually succumb to the plague. He lived a number of weeks with it, but eventually passed away. People knew he had gotten really desperate, because by the end of his life, he was using these kind of medical treatments that were based on superstition and other kinds of things. They weren't things that were considered real medicine, at least as the state of medicine was at the time. So we knew he was really desperate at that point. And he was really insisting on, again, the need to maintain their support for the state, even in the very difficult circumstances that they were in, at that point. He doesn't want to lose the war because he was partly responsible for starting it, right? Even though, in some sense, it was the Corinthians and the Spartans that got together and decided they needed to fight the war. Pericles was clearly open to the idea, as long as they would fight it in a certain way that he thought was the best way to fight it. And again, holding up inside the city walls and focusing on a naval campaign and being patient and not trying to expand their empire was his way of wanting to fight this war. Ultimately, they did not do all those things, as you'll see as we finish the book this week. But that was his idea. And again, so he saw himself as partly responsible for it. So, he wanted them to keep fighting it. He did not want them to come down, to be defeated, to give up and surrender, because that would really destroy his legacy in a lot of ways, at that point, if they had done this. He talks about upholding the laws of the state too, and what the state means. He makes a similar appeal that Socrates made in saying, we owe it to what Athens has provided us. It's educated us. It's brought all this great things to us, right? Our great traditions that we have, our great wealth that we have, the food that we have, the things that we're able to trade for, this great navy that we have, and all those kinds of things. And we owe it to Athens to see this thing through, even though we're having starting to have some more difficult times here. And so that's the kind of appeal that he makes here in his final speech. So these are just the things I wanted to talk about here briefly with you. About the section of reading that we had on these speeches of Pericles. The next section of reading gets into some of the other campaigns that were fought. I'll talk a little bit about those when I do my third lecture, because there were some important things there that had to do with decisions that the Athenian people had to make. Thucydides really gets into showing the differences in the middle part of the text between Sparta's use of oligarchy to fight the war and the way it chose to fight the war, its view of what was appropriate, what was a just war, or to fight a war in a way that was moral and just, versus Athens' approach. And would they start using an eye for an eye kind of approach, or would they try and fight the war according to some unwritten maybe laws or beliefs about what's fair in war? Would you kill the civilian population or not, et cetera, all those kind of things. And we'll get into those a little more directly when I do my next lecture. But think about those things as in this next section of reading, because I think they're important. And again, also in looking at some of the challenges Athens faced in trying to fight the war as a democracy and trying to get the people behind the decisions that were made when it would maybe change its mind. Again, these demagogues who would rise to power and who seemed like they were more focused on their own fame and fortune than doing what was best for the people. And the arguments back and forth, this dialectical technique of thesis, antithesis, and the arguments going back and forth about whether or not they should undertake certain campaigns or not. And that will continue throughout the rest of the war for Athens, some of these challenges. So think about those as you're reading the middle section of the text, and then I'll do a third lecture where I'll pick up on some of those themes and focus then very specifically on the ultimate defeat of Athens and its invasion of Sicily and the Syracusan people. And you get a sense for Thucydides' views on whether or not they were wise in undertaking that campaign. And so I'll talk about that next time. So until then, keep reading and think about some of those issues as you make it your way through the middle part of the text here and then the final part of the text.